Well, here's our first example of me showing you the after photo first, as I talked about in the introduction. Starting with the before and then showing after, there's always the potential for people spotting what you've done very easily. Now, obviously, the person who took this original photo would know, but here's the after photo, and let me show you what the photo looked like originally. Too much flash, way too close. Everything's just completely blown out. Thankfully, there's still some good separation of things, but this is kind of the problem that we're facing. And as you can see in my layers panel, I'll go through this. It took a number of layers to be able to do this. So first, let's just get rid of our other layers, and I'll start from the beginning to show you the steps I took to do this. So the first thing I usually try whenever a photo like this has got overall just way too many highlights, blown out kind of detail, is to try this. Duplicate the background layer and change the blend mode to multiply. Now, overall I like that, but it's almost a little too dark in the background behind her, because now I can't see the separation of her hair. But I do like the fact that it's bringing a little bit of that back again. So that's already a pretty good start. So what I really need to do is work on the wings, because that's the problem area. So I'm going to take a selection tool and do a selection as best I can. Now down here I don't even really know exactly where her costume goes, but I'm just trying to get fairly close. Just do one side and then hold down the shift key and get the other side again, just kind of guessing in this part because I can't really tell. We'll fix that later on. Just going to add a very slight feather, one or two, and then duplicate that. Now, one of the things you'll notice about Photoshop is whenever you duplicate a layer, it also duplicates the blend mode. So because this layer I did first was in multiply at 62%, so will this one be. Well, I'm going to push this all the way to 100 and then duplicate it again, and maybe even one more time. Maybe even one more time. I think I'll just undo that last one. That's pretty good right there. So I take these three layers, because it's multiplying on top of the multiply on top of the multiply, merge them together, and then change the blend mode back to multiply. So now I've got the wings looking pretty good and her costume looking pretty good. There's still a few details that are kind of blown out a little bit, but not as big a problem. And anytime you're fixing a major issue like this, it's all a matter of degree. It's not going to look perfect, but it's going to be pretty good. I mean, I could spend a lot of time going into all these little reflections, but for now I'm just more worried about getting her costume looking good and worrying about the way her face looks. So that's our next major issue, is her face. So what I would do is click on one of these layers, take my magic wand tool with a fairly low tolerance, contiguous off, and just click in the white space, or the hot spot if you will, of her face. And I might hold down the shift key and just try and expand that a little further into the areas. Now, all I want is her face, so I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key with the lasso tool and just get rid of all these surrounding areas that I don't want. Just like this. I don't have to worry too much about this area down here, because I am going to try and cover this up in a different way. That looks pretty much the way I want, so I press Command Control J again and move this layer up where I can see it. And of course at first it's not going to look like much of anything because it's just in normal mode, and it looks like this. So at this point what I would do is take my eyedropper and sample some of the nearby color. On this layer, with layer active, I'm going to go to Edit, Fill. I'm going to use my foreground color, preserve transparency, but I'm also going to change the blend mode to darken. Now at first there are some obvious problems with this. It's too much, it's too intense, it's covered up parts it shouldn't have, and so on. That's okay, that's just sort of the first step. I'm going to also change this blend mode to darken, see if that makes any difference, and lower the opacity. As soon as I lower the opacity, now it's starting to look like it might have some possibilities. So let's zoom in a little closer and see some of the potential problem areas. You can see that it got inside her eyes a little bit, so let's take our eraser tool. Yes, I said eraser. I'm okay with using eraser in a case like this because I certainly don't want to bring back the wrong color in areas that shouldn't be. Now in the case of her teeth, if I erase completely 100%, then she has brilliant white teeth. So I might lower the opacity a little bit so when her teeth are showing, they're not quite so brilliantly white as they were before. So that's looking a little better. Certainly when you compare the blown out details to now, it's a little better. You can also erase the parts here that I know are going to be fixed up, but let's zoom back in again. At this point, there's a couple things I might do. First of all, if I look at just this layer by itself and put the opacity back up for a second, you can see it's got very jagged edges because of the way that I did that, the way I made my selection. So what I might consider doing is doing a little bit of a blur. Just to soften up the edge a little bit so it blends in a little bit better. The thing that's really going to make the difference here, to make it look more natural, is to start doing some painting and dodging and burning. So I'm going to take my brush tool, get a fairly big soft edge brush, lower the opacity down quite a bit, 20-30%, and I'm going to sample some of the other colors like this pink in here and just paint a little bit of that. Here and there. Down underneath her chin where there would probably be a bit more color. Go into the dodge and burn tools and just go in with my burn tool, pretty low opacity, and just do the same kind of thing. Darken up a little bit. Trying to make it so it's not quite, like that last one there, quite so even across the board. And the other thing that will probably make a difference in this case, when I go back and see her skin on the outside, it's got a little bit of a texture, and the new part that I put on has got no texture whatsoever, which is not very good. So I'll go to the filter menu to texture and texturizer. Here's my layer, and I would just go in with a very small amount, so there's just a tiny hint of texture in the skin, so it just looks a little more natural once again. Now the reality is I would probably spend another half hour on her face, because that's kind of obviously the most important part that people are going to look at, but I think that gives you the idea of a good starting point. I'd be turning this layer on and off constantly to try and spot, for example, when I turn this off, I can see that there's a much better definition of her cheek and around her mouth, so I would go back to my burn tool at a smaller size and just try to accentuate that a little bit more. That was probably a little much, but I'm just trying to give you the idea here. The same thing around her nose. Alright, so that's the basic idea for her face, and again we would keep going that, adding different paint colors and so on. Now, down here I'm not exactly sure what's even happening to her costume, so I'm just going to make it up myself. So I'm going to take the rectangular marquee tool, draw a rectangle down here, then take my elliptical marquee tool with the Option or Alt key held down, because I just want to come in here and add a little curve to this. Then take my lasso tool with the Shift key held down, because I really want to just sort of add in to this to make it kind of look like it's matching up a little bit. Now, I could just fill it with a color like white, but obviously that's not going to look very good, besides the fact that it's in the wrong position. It needs to be under her wings, but still, that's not really the point, is just having it white is not going to be very useful. So here's one of the reasons why anytime I have an opportunity, I take photos of textures. Here's a wedding dress that I didn't have a purpose for, but I just took a photo of it because I thought it was a neat texture. Well, in this case, this could be something I could use. So I'm going to copy that, switch back here, and use paste into to create a new layer which has got my shape in there. And then it's just a matter of making it look a little more realistic by finding the parts. Like in here, I think I'll just kind of, where I can see her costume, even though that's probably not where it looks like it went down this way, I'm just going to do it like this so I can have more control over it. And the same on this side. Let's try and make it kind of fit in with what we've got here. It's looking not too bad, although I'm thinking it would probably match her dress a little more. So let's take the eyedropper and pick up some of the color off of her wings. I'm going to load this as selection, Command and Control, click on that layer mask, and then let's add a hue saturation adjustment layer with colorize turned on. And I'll just make sure, even though I thought I'd put it up there, it chose not to go. So I'm going to move it up to the top so it will colorize the correct area. And now it's just a matter of doing some tweaking. Now, so obviously I don't have quite enough of the replacement skin, if you will, there. So I'll take this layer, go and get my smudge tool with a great big smudge brush and just kind of smudge it over. And that should be just enough to expand that layer so now it fills in the bits and pieces. Now one more time to actual size to see how I'm doing. Overall, I'm quite happy with it. It looks pretty good. As I said before, I would probably do a little bit more. So here's one more thing I might try in this case, just because I notice when I look at her face, the original, she looks obviously like she has a few freckles here and there, and I'm kind of lost that a little bit. So an optional step. I'm going to add a new layer, sample this kind of darker color, and then fill the layer. I'm going to go to Filter, Artistic, Sponge. Now here I played around with different sizes and the definition and the smoothness. Click OK. Just going to apply that to our layer, which obviously looks really bad. I'm going to clip these two layers together. Hold down the Option or Alt key between the layers. So now it's only showing here. It still looks like she has a disease. So I don't want to do that. So we need to try a blend mode. Now, to cut to the chase, I found that if I did color burn and then lowered the opacity a fair bit, just kind of added a bit more texture, a bit more color, something of that nature. If we want to randomize this a bit more, add a layer mask to this layer and do the render clouds. So that's going to put a layer mask like this, and all it's going to do is kind of randomize our texture a little bit. So am I finished yet? Not entirely. I'd again spend more time on her face, but overall, let's just take a look at the original to where I am now. I'm quite happy with those results, and working on a little further, I think I could end up with something that I'd be happy to print off and give to them and say, here's your fixed photograph.